Welcome to day 14 of the war in Iran. Let's take a look at the situation. In general, it can be said so far that the United States and Israel have absolute air superiority in Iran. Overall, Iran's fleet has been almost completely destroyed. The Air Force is barely operational, if at all. Drone and missile launch bases were specifically targeted and in some cases heavily damaged or destroyed. The same goes for the air defense systems, most of which are almost no longer operational. Nevertheless, the United States and Israel will not be able to win the war this way if they continue as before. They know it themselves. The internet is full of reporters. Opinions are so divided that it's nearly impossible to tell facts from opinions. So while some rather unenthusiastic reporters are currently living in a wet dream after the United States attacks, in reality a picture is emerging that shows military strength clearly, but without any real objective. We'll take a look at the latest developments in Iran, and then I'll show you why the United States can't win the war if they keep going the way they have been. Let's start with the important topic. For some reason, and I don't know why, but for some reason it was claimed a few days ago that Iran had mined the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, some clickbait-hungry YouTubers picked it up again, and I deliberately didn't include it in my report because I couldn't find a single piece of evidence to support it. Now, the Minister of War is also writing that there is no evidence of the strait being mined. Then I think this topic is settled for now until the opposite can be proven. New satellite images confirm earlier reports and heavy losses of the Iranian Air Force at Khatami Air Base with the 8th Tactical Air Base northeast of Isfahan. The image shows that during last week's Israeli airstrikes, apparently about a dozen aircraft at the base were attacked and destroyed. According to the images, among the damaged or destroyed aircraft are several F-14 Tomcats as well as other fighter jets of the Iranian Air Force. The base is considered one of the most important locations of the Iranian Air Force. The losses therefore affect a part of the country's already limited operational fighter jet fleet. But let's stay with the Air Force for now. United States military officials have confirmed the crash of a KC-135 Stratotanker refueling aircraft of the United States Air Force in western Iraq. According to United States military officials, an accident occurred during a mission to support ongoing air operations over Iran. According to this, two tankers were operating together when an incident occurred that led to the crash of one of the aircraft. The United States Central Command, or United States Central Command, stated in a brief statement that the second aircraft was able to land safely. At the same time, the command emphasized that the crash was not caused by enemy fire or injuries to the crew of the Stratotankers. For example, like the incident involving the F-15E from last week. Instead, all indications point to an accident during the operation. The KC-135 Stratotanker is one of the most important support aircraft of the United States Air Force. It is primarily used to refuel fighter jets and bombers, allowing them to carry out much longer missions. The minimum crew of a KC-135 consists of 3 people: the pilot, co-pilot, and a so-called boom operator, who is responsible for refueling other aircraft. However, the United States reports 6 people who are very likely to have been killed. By the way, here is a picture of the second tanker after landing. Oh, thank goodness. It's nice that people are always at the airfield taking pictures, so I can judge them. I'm not an expert, but the whole thing doesn't look like an attempted shoot-down to me, since there are no visible shrapnel marks on the fin, as you would typically see with an anti-aircraft missile. If I find a picture, I can show it like I usually do. This here looks way too clean, and to me it looks like they collided here. The United States apparently wants to release part of its strategic oil reserves. President Trump explained this in an interview with the local television station Local 12. According to him, Washington plans to reduce the reserves a little to push down the oil price. By putting additional supplies on the market, rising energy prices are to be cushioned. The reserves of the United States are mainly located on the Gulf Coast in Texas and Louisiana. They currently comprise around 415 million barrels of crude oil, which is an amount that corresponds to just about 4 days of global oil consumption. The release of such reserves is usually used in crisis situations or during strong price fluctuations to create short-term stability in the energy market. And that brings us to the first problem. Because the current course of the war between the United States, Israel, and Iran reveals a fundamental strategic problem. The military approach of the United States and Israel does produce tactical effects, but so far it has not led to any clear strategic outcome. If the pattern of previous operations continues, then an actual military victory is extremely unlikely. At the beginning of the operation, the United States and Israel relied on a classic concept of modern air warfare, the rapid elimination of the enemy leadership. In the first days, they mainly succeeded in eliminating central figures of the Iranian security apparatus, including high-ranking military commanders, leading representatives of the Revolutionary Guards, as well as other key figures of the military and political leadership. This kind of decapitation strike, meaning the targeted destruction of a leadership system, has been part of the arsenal of Western military strategies for decades, especially those of the United States, and has already been used in previous conflicts. However, the fundamental problem with this strategy becomes apparent immediately afterwards. Leadership structures can be replaced. States, especially authoritarian systems with strongly ideologized power structures, particularly here in a very Islamic state, are prepared to quickly compensate for losses at the leadership level. That's exactly what happened in Iran. Within a short period of time, the political leadership was reorganized and the succession was established, which continues the same political course as before. As a result, the original blow loses much of its strategic impact. Even if individual people are eliminated, the problem remains that systems as a whole persist. On the contrary, such attacks can even have the opposite effect by further strengthening internal cohesion and reinforcing anti-Western narratives. Another second strategic problem is the lack of an internal opposition that could or would be supported militarily or politically. Historically, military interventions often only succeed when they are accompanied by a local force that can take power after the overthrow of a government. Such a structure has not yet been visible in the conflict. There is no organized movement within the country that openly cooperates with the United States of America or Israel, or that would be able to establish an alternative government system that, for example, would be pro-Western or aligned with the interests of the attacker. Without such an internal force, the internal and especially the military approach remains very limited to airstrikes and limited attacks against military infrastructure or infrastructure in general. These attacks can destroy military facilities and temporarily weaken capacities, as we have seen, for example, with the destruction of the Air Force, but they do not change the fundamental political situation in the country. At the same time, Iran apparently pursues a strategy that relies heavily on time and economic pressure. Militarily, Tehran is clearly inferior to the United States, but asymmetric strategies allow it to prolong the conflict and increase the costs for the opponent. A central component of this strategy is the disruption of regional energy infrastructure. Attacks on refineries, energy facilities, or transport routes have a direct impact on the high stability of global energy markets. The temporary interruption of refinery production in the region, as well as restrictions in the Strait of Hormuz, are already showing initial effects. Such disruptions not only cause problems regionally, but also have immediate consequences for the entire world market, especially for Western economies that are highly dependent on stable energy prices. This shifts the conflict increasingly into an economic dimension. For the United States, a political risk arises. Rising energy prices have a direct impact on the domestic political mood. In a political environment where elections play a central role, such economic consequences can put significant pressure on the government. There is also another strategic dilemma. While the United States military capabilities are enormous, their options for deployment are politically limited. A large-scale ground offensive against Iran would be a military operation. The country has large armed forces consisting of the regular army and the Revolutionary Guards, totaling about 1.6 million men, as well as a huge geographical obstacle: its topography. Iran is a vast country with extensive mountainous regions. Such terrain favors defenders and makes large-scale invasions especially difficult. At the same time, parts of the Iranian armed forces have extensive experience in asymmetric warfare and guerrilla fighting. For an invasion, this would mean that even a quick military victory would not automatically lead to stable control, a scenario that would strongly resemble previous conflicts such as Afghanistan or Iraq. It is precisely these experiences that shape the political restraint of the United States. A full-scale invasion would tie up enormous financial and military resources and could drag on for years or even decades. It was the same with Afghanistan. Back then, nobody knew. Hey, we're involved now. How long is this going to last? And then it dragged on forever. Many other conflicts follow the same path. The political costs of such a war would be huge, as we see in Ukraine. Another attack which wasn't carried out by the United States but by Russia was also supposed to be over quickly. But now it's already in its 5th year. It's now in its 5th year of war, with no real end in sight. That's why the current strategy is limited to airstrikes and restricts military operations from the sea. 2 aircraft carrier groups and accompanying warships form the backbone of the military presence. These forces can continuously strike targets, but they are not suitable for controlling a large country politically or militarily, and especially not from the air. This leads to another core problem: the lack of a clearly defined end state for the war. Military operations require a clear political objective, a point at which it can be declared that the operation has been successfully completed. At the beginning of the conflict, several objectives were stated: the weakening of the so-called axis of resistance, the destruction of the Iranian missile program, the neutralization of military capabilities, and in some cases even a possible regime change. But the longer this conflict lasts, the more these objectives disappear from official communication. Especially regime change is hardly mentioned anymore. This suggests that even political decision-makers realize how difficult this goal actually is to achieve. There was a very interesting conference on March 10th where Foreign Minister Rubio didn't even mention this goal anymore. So without a clear end goal, a strategic vacuum emerges. Airstrikes can continue, but they do not necessarily lead to a situation where a victory is clearly identifiable. Infrastructure can be destroyed, but it can also be rebuilt. Military installations can be hit, but the system that operates them remains in place and can purchase new ones. From the Iranian perspective, this very situation could be part of a long-term strategy to prolong the conflict for as long as possible, increase the costs of the war, and at the same time survive militarily and further consolidate the regime's hold on power. Even if individual facilities are destroyed, houses are blown up, and so on, they can eventually be replaced. From this perspective, what matters is not only immediate military success, but above all, the political and economic burden placed on the opponent. If this dynamic continues, the conflict could enter a phase in which both sides try to present their own narrative. The United States could at some point declare that they have simply achieved their military objectives and can now withdraw and basically declare the war over by eliminating a certain leadership policy or military capabilities. At the same time, Iran would spread its own version of the conflict and claim that it survived the attack and managed to withstand the United States. And the regime is still standing and things continue just as before, and now they're simply rebuilding everything, and now everyone hates the West even more. This creates a scenario that is extremely problematic from a strategic point of view. A war without a clear victory, but with high costs for everyone involved. The central question, therefore, remains open. How is this conflict supposed to end? Without a clear political objective and without a realistic strategy to achieve this goal, the war risks entering a phase of permanent military actions, which may produce spectacular headlines, but do not bring about any lasting change in the strategic situation. And Iran can simply drag this out. If the United States simply declares the war over, Iran could send a few more drones to the Middle East, hit a few more power plants or oil depots. Prices here will keep rising, then the United States will do something again, maybe blow up 2 or 3 buildings as a symbolic act, and a week later, Iran will do the same thing again. It costs them absolutely nothing, but for us it has extreme consequences. And with these words, I want to thank all subscribers, channel members, and the Alja crew. Special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Renica, Steeler 30, and Frederick Mayer Hofer. Please subscribe, like, comment, and see you in the next Situation Report.